Afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting shortly, pretty much in 3 past 3. But good to have you all join us. Looking forward to today's session. Yeah, I think as you join in, I think it'll be great if you again can just say hi in the chat, let people know your name and maybe where you're joining from and the organization that you are working for. I think it's like the second session, so we're still also pretty much new, and I'm getting to know everyone who is in the class. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining. This is the second session of the Catalytic Capital Implementation Training course. And yeah, I hope last week was a really amazing session for you guys, a good introduction. It was great to hear from Harry as well. And so today we're going to continue along the similar vein to last week, where we're just trying to get some foundational concepts of Catalytic Capital in before we start moving on to the process of deploying Catalytic Capital and some of the considerations around that. So yeah, just to get started, it would just be great if you let us know how you're doing. Put it in the chat, and then also keen to hear from you. What did you learn from last week's session? And then what are you looking forward to in this session? Again, put it in the chat and I'll try to read some of that out as well. So maybe 2 minutes or so. Let's see who's got fastest fingers first, right? I learned what qualifies to be Catalytic Capital. Great, that's great. Thanks, Afua. Yeah, we definitely went through the definition of Catalytic Capital. I'll recap that today. Only one response, come on. Quick fire responses, and it doesn't have to be a book. Hey Kate, you're doing well, that's great. I found the distinction between concession return and non-repairable capital when identifying Catalytic Capital very helpful. That's good. Yeah, we're also going to, like, again, highlight that today in the session when we look at the Catalytic Capital spectrum. Yeah, and why we also covered why there are Catalytic Capital gaps. That's good. Yeah, Harry was incredible, really good as well to hear from him. Unmet capital needs. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Ivan. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, please keep on putting those in. It's always interesting to read and just see what everyone's takeouts from the previous session, and even what you're looking forward to this session. I think it's always good. And I hope you are all doing well. It's in the, I don't know where you're joining us from, but I mean, it is afternoon this side, so we're heading towards the end of the day. So hopefully there's still that last bit of energy that we can channel into today. So before we start, I mean, just a reminder of housekeeping rules. Rename yourself by clicking the 3 dots just above your little camera. I think it's great so that when you are speaking, we're able to see what your name is and where you're joining us from. please, again, just a shout out to please, if possible, please let's keep your cameras on. And then especially if you are speaking, it's really good just so we're not looking at gray boxes, just to see your faces. And then, yeah, it just really helps make this virtual environment a lot more enriching and rewarding for both us as the guest speakers and also the facilitators, but for the rest of the group as well. And then if you want to speak, please raise your hand. We have what we have done this session as well is we do have dedicated question slides. So yeah, hold on to those questions, write them down, put them in the chat, and then we will encourage and welcome you to contribute during the question time. So just a quick recap from last week. So we really looked at what the definition of catalytic capital is and the definition we're going to use for this course. And so we looked at it from 4 key components. The first being that when we define catalytic capital, it takes on or accepts disproportionate risk and or concessional return in order to create positive impact, and then crowd in third-party capital that otherwise would not be possible. So those are the 4 key elements we did, and then we saw how we could then apply that into certain case studies to identify whether the transaction was catalytic capital or not. So I think that was the key thing, is discussing what the definition of catalytic capital is. And then we also looked at why is it important. So we identified some capital gaps. We know about the massive capital gap for SDGs in general, but looking at particular underserved people and populations, and where capital, traditional and conventional capital is not flowing towards, leaving these stark capital gaps, particularly in certain sectors as well, like we saw health and education, which is like receiving 3 times less funding than something like energy and financial services are. We saw SMMEs as a capital gap and funding gap there as well. And so we had a look at that. And so that's what we covered mainly in webinar 1. And so this is where we are in this session, and we are going to be speaking around the capital spectrum. And we're going to look at the ecosystem, roles and uses, and barriers. And then we'll have Harvey, who's here. I think maybe Harvey, if you can just give a wave. So great to have you here. He's going to speak to us about some of the work he's doing on capital gaps in the last hour, which I think is going to be incredible. So again, this is the agenda for today. I won't go through it. I have spoken through what we're going to cover today. Okay, so moving on to lesson 4, and just noting as well some of the questions from last week. I did have a look at it, and we will get some clarity on some of the things, especially around grant capital, as we go through the slides here. But before we start, I think I also want to call on Umi, if you are here, Umi, to maybe speak about office hours, which we're looking to offer the cohorts.
Thank you, Jason, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I am calling in from Chicago, so it's nice and early here. I think we really enjoyed the conversation and the engagement last time. I know, as Jason referenced, we didn't really get through all the questions. We'll be prioritizing that because we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please hold on to your questions, and as things occur to you, write them down or put them in the chat. And, we'll make it our responsibility really for Jason and team. He is very focused on this to come back to you with responses. Now, I will be on today for the first half of the call, and happy to chime in on sort of investor experiences based on Bakata's work and the work that we see around us being done by peer philanthropies and catalytic capital and impact investing. So please feel free to ask more questions and to share what is on your mind. We may not have time to cover everything while we're on the call, but we will get through all of this systematically. And in that spirit, what we'd like to offer is a couple of office hour sessions, maybe one on Monday next week. We'll send an email out after the session with timing and how to sign up. We are anticipating that there'll be a few of you that might be interested in those. So we'd like to offer up 10-minute sessions, up to 10-minute sessions. If you need less time, that's also fine. With me and other investors, Monday session I will do. But we'll try to pull in other folks for the next session as well, which we'll try to do in a couple of weeks after that. And really an opportunity for you to sort of ask questions, share more, and even talk about your own journey or questions that you have. We're happy to be a sounding board as peer investors. Also, just sort of making sure that all of you are interested. If there is not enough interest, we let that go. We don't want to burden you with additional sessions at this time. So more to come from the team, but there will be 10-minute slots to pick. We'll offer an hour on Monday and an hour later. So we're looking at 10, 12 folks who can chime in. If we have higher demand than that, then we'll figure something out. Thanks, Jason.
Great. Thanks, Omi, and thanks so much for availing yourself for that and the initiative for it. I think I would definitely encourage everyone to take advantage. I think it's incredible that we can learn from each other in that way. Also, a quick note, I do realize that some of you have had some issues in terms of accessing the platform. And so I have been alerted that we sent out an email this morning that with some of the latest batch, you wouldn't have got an email notification. There was an administrative error in terms of selecting that and activating that, but you can actually log in with a passcode, which is UCT, I think GSB 2025, with a star at the end. But I think that was shared via the email sent to you. If you are still struggling, please reach out to me. Happy to help, and we'll get you access as soon as possible. All right. So yeah, so today we're going to look at Catalytic capital and the capital spectrum. And in doing this, we're also going to have a look at what is the difference between Catalytic capital and philanthropy, I think, which is a question that did arise in our first session, which we were trying to figure out what is the role of grant capital in terms of Catalytic capital and where does it fit in. So we're going to address that today. We're also going to look at what is the difference between Catalytic capital and blended finance, and then we'll go through just a quick case study of what that looks like in practice. So this is the spectrum of capital, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but essentially it places impact investing in between what we know as conventional philanthropy, which is more on the impact side, impact focus inside, where there's no returns. And then we have traditional investing, which is on the left side, which focus on trying to maximize your returns. And then as you move from the left to the right, you start getting more and more focus on some of the social and environmental impact parts by looking at responsible investing, sustainable investing, start bringing in ESG, which is really looking at a risk mitigating framework. How do you minimize the risk of outside factors on the business? But then you start moving into the realm of impact investing, where you're looking at how you can intentionally create impact with your investment. But with impact investing, it's creating impact, but it's alongside financial return. So there is an expectation of return for impact investing. And so where Catalytic capital fits in is that it's a subset of impact investing. And it's a subset of impact investing that obviously focuses a lot on impact and crowding in capital. And so you can see that's where it fits on that side, where it's not a finance first approach, but it's more of an impact first approach. And so again, to clarify, it's a subset of impact investing. So there is an expectation of financial return in it, but it has more flexibility in terms of getting below market rate returns, taking on more risk in order to achieve that impact. So it's really looking at impact first. So the role of philanthropy. So philanthropic capital, as we saw from the previous previous slide, that it's separate from catalytic capital, but it can be catalytic, and we acknowledge that. So while on its own it's not defined as catalytic capital, it can be catalytic in its nature. It can crowd in investments. It does generate positive impact. But as we saw from the previous session, there isn't a return expectation on that. And so that's important to highlight that catalytic capital is investment capital and therefore has return expectations, whereas philanthropy in the form of grant capital does not require a return and therefore is not investment capital. So one of the questions brought up is a recoverable grant catalytic capital? So in the definition that we've got here, it's not, because with the recoverable grants, it's not really a requirement of a return, but a return can happen now. But we do acknowledge, as Umi was saying, that there has been discussions around it and trying to be a little bit more inclusive of some of the aspects and the important role that grant capital can play in the space of catalytic capital. But in terms of the definition we're discussing, we're really looking at investment capital. But that comes also with a note: if we are applying grants in a capital structure, example as a first loss layer or guarantee, then this could also be considered catalytic capital. And that leads us into the next slide, where we are looking at blended finance. So if we're aware of the definition of blended finance, we know that blended finance speaks of when you are using concessional capital or philanthropic or public capital that is taking on below market rate return and using it to then mobilize private sector capital that is actually seeking market rate return. And you have these two forms of capital then are blended together. And so catalytic capital, that below market rate return seeking capital, is a core ingredient of blended finance. However, it's important to state that catalytic capital can be deployed on its own without the need to be blended with other financing. And so that's the difference. So catalytic capital can be part of blended finance structure and it is a core ingredient of it. But catalytic capital can also be deployed directly into early stage companies without the need with blending it with other capital. And also blended finance can include elements that are not catalytic capital, for example, technical assistance facilities that are grant funded. And so example of catalytic capital in blended finance structure is cross-boundary energy. So it's on-site solar generation for commercial and industrial business in sub-Saharan Africa. So it was launched in 2015 and it was $8 million blended fund, and it uses a two-tier equity structure. So USA provided 1.3 million in junior equity, so taking on a little bit more risk in the capital stack. And this was then used to catalyze a larger investment of senior investors, senior equity investors. And so leveraging that first loss layer, they were able to then bring forward more senior equity into the structure. So it just shows the ability to crowd in that senior private sector capital by taking on more risk in the transaction. So moving on to who is in the ecosystem, and don't worry, there will be an opportunity after this section to ask questions, because I feel that there may be some questions related to that will come up, but we will get there soon. This is quite a quick section. It's really looking at who are the providers of catalytic capital, who are the recipients, and then what are some of the service providers that you can see within the space. So catalytic capital providers include public development institutions, charitable foundations, and then we also get family offices and high net worth individuals are normally the key players in the space. But then you also get corporate foundations as well that can also play in the space. And each of them have their own motivations in terms of their deployments of catalytic capital, which is essentially what the slide shows. For instance, we have Global Foundation and Gates Foundation, whereas they're really looking to see how they can seed scalable impact innovations out. And then we have Corporate Foundation, which may be looking how we can actually scale impact enterprises. And so I want you to keep these in mind because we're going to come back to it a bit later when we speak about the roles and uses of catalytic capital. And so development finance institutions may also have a motivation about how can we potentially attract other investors? How do we crowd in additional capital providers? And then a family office may be, how do we then maximize our return, our impact return with a very much an impact focus. So we heard from Sinith last week from Harry, which was great. So then you had a Catalytic capital provider that was actually here and chatting to us. In terms of enterprises, so enterprises are those projects that are targeting social and environmental impact, and then they normally do not get or receive funding from conventional capital sources. And so mainstream impact capital, as we saw last week, with 74% of impact investors actually seeking market rate returns. So there is a huge gap of enterprises that are actually not receiving mainstream impact capital, and so they may require Catalytic capital. And then you also have funds and other vehicles and other intermediaries. So those that are targeting these enterprises, the underlying enterprises that require Catalytic capital. So you can also get funds that have that specific mandate that are in need of Catalytic capital from investors. We have ecosystem builders. So Catalytic Capital Consortium is an ecosystem builder. It's really looking to provide knowledge, build the space, research, provide some data, case studies, and even consulting organizations. So Bertha Centre, AVPA, Catalytic Capital Consortium all form part of that ecosystem building cohort that is really trying to grow the space and grow the amount of Catalytic capital on the continent, but also globally. And then we have advisors as well. So those that can give specific advice when you are doing Catalytic capital deal structuring and investments. So I'm going to stop there for any questions. And so what I know there's questions in the chat, and thanks for those. But if any of you want to maybe put your camera on and unmute and just ask a question, please let's feel free to do that. I don't think I'm seeing any questions at this stage. Catherine, go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, I just had a question about where NGOs, international NGOs may fit into the ecosystem of the different actors that you talked about. Do you think they fall under ecosystem builders?
I can jump in there. Yeah, Catherine, I think that that's an interesting question. I think we see them as really sort of leadership actors. In some ways, they play a multitude of these roles. For sure, they have the donor and the investor pots of money, right? They'll always have some money that they use as grants, which is the biggest pot of money usually they have. But then they also really do some ecosystem building. They often work in partnership with local governments. So that's a different role, which is not really articulated in the set of actors that you saw. But I think that when we look at impact investing in particular, I think regulatory roles and a little bit more sort of field infrastructure roles at a broader level are often played by governments and DFIs. And NGOs, it kind of depends. A lot of them are very focused on particular activities. If you think about something like, I'm just sort of picking a random one, let's say Save the Children, and I don't know if anybody from Save the Children is here, but historically, a lot of the work they've done has been grant-led, but it has also been focused on building different infrastructure sort of setups in countries. And I know that they've done a fair amount of work in impact investing and thinking about what are some of the legs that are necessary in a market economy for impact investing to be effective and successful. So I think they kind of straddle different roles, but oftentimes I think they lead with the grant making and field building roles. Thank you.
Thank you, Ami.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. See, the chat is quite active. Do you have a few examples of grants used in a capital structure that you consider would be Catalytic capital? So I think especially if you're looking at grants, any structure where grants is used in the form of guarantees or first loss, There's a few examples if you look in the slide deck. Due to time constraints, we couldn't go through them, but there is there. And then also there's a resource in the recommended reading on convergence. And we're actually going to have Akif join us, I think, in 2 weeks' time. There's a lot of great resources and case studies there, which show you a lot of good examples of catalytic capital being deployed now.
Jason, I see a raised hand. I think that's Fatima.
Yes, go ahead, Fatima.
Yeah, thank you so much, and apologies for being off camera. I have a sleeping baby on top of me. Just a clarifying question on grant capital, and perhaps this has been answered, but when foundation or philanthropic funding is used indirectly, so it's used by a grantee to invest, whether it's as a first loss capital layer, or in some other concessional way, is that considered catalytic capital? It's a bit of an indirect scenario, right? Because it's not being directly invested by a private foundation. It's going to a grantee, and then that grantee is investing that money forward in the form of a sub-award or a sub-grant. And the returns are going back to the grantee, not to the foundation.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Fatima. And this is an interesting sort of structure. I will say when we kind of started out, we looked at this cleanly as saying that the money or the funding provided by the funder was provided in the form of a grant. So we're going to sort of not really look at what happens beyond that. But I think over the course of time, we're seeing more and more instances where this money then goes on to play the role of catalytic capital, right? It gets deployed in settings and in uses where it is acting just the way catalytic capital would. And to your point, what is being provided as capital and not as grant money that is not intended to be returned. So we are leaning towards acknowledging that this is also a use that we want to understand and study and record. Because it plays a very similar role and does really the same kinds of things that you would get from capital that was invested as capital all along the chain. So I think this is an interesting and nuanced question, and we often see this in the context, actually, I think we just had a question on donor agencies. We oftentimes see that sometimes there are pots of money that are coming from grant and aid sources and get utilized in this way by the recipient, whoever the recipient, right? So I think that's great. And then, I just want to do a shout out to Harvey, who's going to be talking later today. Harvey Koh has worked extensively with our C3 team. And in fact, he authored along with his colleagues the original FAQ document that we put out in 21, 22 actually, early 22 on these sorts of questions. But Fatima, I would just take your question as a moment to sort of talk to all of you about this and note that this is an evolving understanding of how things work and where we see the best uses, right? So we are definitely, everything that we're doing is informed by what we hear in the field and how people are experiencing the use and contributions of catalytic capital.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Amy. And yeah, thanks for that question, Fatima. Very interesting. And yeah, like you say, quite nuanced. So I am going to hop to the next few slides. We will have opportunity for questions again after this. But let's quickly hop on. So this is roles and uses of catalytic capital. So we're going to look at what are the roles of catalytic capital and then what are uses, and then we'll do an interactive case study where I invite you as a class to read a case study and then vote on what you believe the role and uses are for that particular case study. So we're looking at roles. There are 3 roles that have been introduced to help us try and understand why catalytic capital is deployed and then what are the motivations behind it. So you remember I was speaking about some of the capital providers and certain motivations and certain uses that they have for their capital. So this is where it comes into play here as well. So the different roles we are going to look at is seeding, scaling, and sustaining. So when we speak about seeding, Again, you think about the recipients, we had enterprises and funds, so we can look at it from both those levels. And so when we look at enterprises, seeding Catalytic Capital looks at supporting those impact enterprises that have not yet achieved break even or have slim operating margins. So it's really early stage, like that startup type vibe. And then we move on to scaling, where on scaling side, you are looking to realize economies of scale and trying to expand and reach more underserved geographies and population segments. And then the third one is sustaining. So it's also important to note that with seeding and scaling, it's almost on a transient or continuum. So you can have an enterprise that starts at seeding, and then they require Catalytic capital there. Then it moves on to scaling, right? And then it requires Catalytic capital there. But the hope is that as this enterprise grows, they move from seeding to scaling, and then eventually they would not require Catalytic capital, but will be able to attract mainstream impact capital. So it's trying to almost wean off that concessionality or that additional risk. Whereas sustaining are those enterprises that require subsidy on an ongoing basis, and they have like business models that are not designed to be fully sustainable. And so they're really in they're in areas of where there's structural problems, and there's difficulty in actually providing long-term returns in those areas. And so, yeah, with sustaining, it's normally persistent and long-term structural gaps, which are very difficult to move beyond that into, let's say, a scaling or seeding and attract private sector capital. But those enterprises are still providing valuable impact towards vulnerable beneficiaries, but their business models and because of a variety of external factors, they really struggle to move to a point of where they can be financially attractive. So at the same time, you have this at the fund level. So when you're looking at funds, it's looking at those newer funds that are being established, new management teams, or maybe a new investment strategy or new structural instruments. So that's when you want to provide capital to those funds that are already in that new stage. And then you also get impact funds or vehicles that are looking to scale in terms of their underlying targeted enterprises. And here, focus is very much on how you can mobilize private capital towards those scaling enterprises. And then, as I said, on the fund level, you may be supporting impact funds or vehicles that are targeting areas of like long-term structural gaps that have high and persistent risks. And then they're also only able to deliver some commercial returns. So then we're looking at uses. So those are the roles. So again, to just recap, we had seeding, scaling, and sustaining, where you had seeding and scaling is almost like on a continuum, where it's transient, where you can actually move as an enterprise or fund from seeding all the way to scaling, and that's the hope you want to do. But then you also have sustaining, which is more of a structural issue with long-term risks, and that which can still provide good impact, but it's very difficult for it to move towards commercial capital. So uses of capital, Catalytic capital, there's 5 uses we're going to look at. It's facilitating innovation, helping build track record, then leveraging additional investments, and then signaling impact potential. And the last one is safeguarding mission. So the first one, facilitating innovation. So Catalytic capital can then be deployed. That's going to help to generate better solutions through experimentation. And then it's going to help to more efficient solutions towards social and environmental problems. So just allowing that space for experimentation with some of that capital that is a lot more flexible in its nature. More money. So innovation is inherently risky, so it's difficult to attract capital from commercial markets. And also one of the added issues here is that innovation often sometimes benefits the broader market and society, but then it may not compensate that enterprise that actually came up with that innovation. And so Catalytic capital helps to alleviate some of these risks related to innovation. And if you think back to last week when we were speaking about capital gaps, innovation was one of those ones we were looking at as well. More time. So the subsidy provided by Catalytic Capital can allow for more time and flexibility to develop more impact-oriented business models. Helping to build track record. So I think this is also quite important because it then enables you to build up almost like evidence and data around a particular enterprise or impact that has been created. And then you're able to demonstrate, like, you are able to create this impact, you are able to demonstrate that you're having this amount of financial return. And then this is able to then be communicated to investors, which will better help them to evaluate the risk through looking at some of that data. So it helps build a track record by allowing the enterprise to grow and start to collect some of that data. Leveraging additional investments. So we've spoken quite a bit about this, the power of Catalytic Capital to crowd in additional resources, and doing this through the likes of, well, for instance, we've seen with blended finance, where you're able to put guarantees and first loss, maybe take on a subordinate equity position. So you're able to do that, which then helps to adjust the different risk and return appetites within those capital structures, enabling more players to come in. And then we have leverage, which we've spoken about as well, where because of the more favorable terms that you get, investees can access these capital as well. Because there's someone taking on additional risks, they're able to get more favorable terms. Signaling impact potential. So you could have a reputable Catalytic Capital provider that then says, look, I'm going to provide capital to this enterprise or fund, and then that gives elements of credibility and visibility to that enterprise. And then other investors will see this and see the potential for impact, which could then increase their willingness to invest within that particular investee. Then the last one is safeguarding mission. And so Catalytic Capital providers can actually play in that space where they can provide the Catalytic Capital, but they can also ensure that there's no mission drift and make sure that that enterprise or investee is focused on creating that impact, which is really important and attracted the capital in the first place. And so they can also assist with allowing for proposed impact targets and also help with their impact measurements and management systems. So to recap the roles again, we have seeding, scaling, and sustaining. And then we have the 5 uses which have introduced, which is facilitating innovation, signaling impact, leveraging additional investment, building track record, and safeguarding mission. So I've mentioned those again, just to keep in mind, because you're going to need to refer to those when we go through the case study. So I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to give the class opportunity of, let's say, 5 minutes. Just read through this case study, and then I want you to make a note of what are the roles that's being played here. So is it seeding, is it scaling, is it sustaining? And then think about why you're saying that as well, based on your understanding of what seeding, scaling, and sustaining means. And then after that, also think about uses. So is this facilitating innovation? Is it safeguarding mission? Is it signaling impact potential? Is it leveraging additional investments? And then just try and then think around what are the uses for this. And then we're actually going to run a poll as well. And so once you've thought through that, after you've read through it for 5 minutes, just put in the poll, and then we can see where everyone stands in terms of roles and uses for this particular case. Yeah, so I'm just going to go back to give you guys the opportunity to maybe write down. So these are the uses. You can write it down or make note of it. Okay. So if I can ask my team if they can maybe launch the first poll around the roles. Okay, it's launched together, so you can answer both. Okay, I'm smiling because I realized that a lot of you might have seen that the seeding tag came up. And then so everyone is voting seeding now. So let me pop it up there, since I think it did pop up as I was trying to navigate back. So yes, seeding is really the role that we are seeing here. Okay, then I'm seeing in terms of some of the uses, we've got the highest being help build track record, facilitating innovation coming in second, signaling impact potential. Then we've got leveraging additional investments and safeguarding mission. So before I put it up, I want to maybe invite someone to come and share why they went with their choice and what their choices were. Just trying to see, is there any hands? Anyone want to maybe share why they chose those particular uses? Kate?
Sure, yeah. So I initially chose building a track record, as it does mention the last sentence in the funding rationale, establishing itself in the market, and then also facilitating innovation, as it's the first in the kind, as it's the first of its kind. It offers the opportunity to build those better solutions to cancer care, and in turn providing more money and providing more time in the treatment.
Okay, amazing. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for sharing. It's Shidi. Is that correct?
It's Siri.
Shidi.
So I was torn between facilitating innovation and leveraging additional funds, but I eventually chose not to go with facilitating innovation on the grounds that innovation for cancer care already exists elsewhere. It's just that it did not exist in Ghana. So thinking is, if it's not new, it's not necessarily innovation, it's just bringing it to Ghana. Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Shidi.
I chose leveraging additional funds, seeing that there were different funders that came respectively to try and leverage each other's funding structures.
That's good. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. I think thanks, CD and Kate. So I'm going to show, and also just to say that I think these are like suggested uses that we as a team have spotted here. And I think there is multiple potential uses, right? Some which are not all shown here. But it's good to start thinking around, when you are deploying Catalytic capital, what is the role of it? And then what are some of the uses you envision for it to be used? So facilitating innovation, really looking at it being one of the, like, as you rightfully said, CD is maybe not the first in the global context, but in Ghana, in that context, it's really looking at being a newish innovation. And then we had help build a track record, which Kate, you mentioned as well. And so those were the two main ones, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there may be other uses as well, as like signaling impact and leveraging additional investments. Any questions at this stage?
Jason, this is Vandana here from SNB. I was just wondering, in this particular case of Ghana, whether like a 10 or 12% market rate returns is considered concessional, like in this don't you think it's still on the higher side in terms of at least it not being single-digit market returns? Does it count as concessional and catalytic in that sense?
It's a good question. Do we have someone on the call from Ghana? That can maybe give insight in what the market rate return is in Ghana?
Jason, I can jump in. I will not be able to sort of comment on Ghana in particular. But I think broadly, Vandana, what we would have established is at the time that this was done, this would have been considered not market rate. And I don't have the full details of the actual case or the situation in front of me, but the other considerations would be sort of political and market risk and how you take into account all of those monies, because the moment you have sort of cross-border monies, it also gets a little bit more complicated. And so I would say that you need to look at really how market rate returns are being provided in those in comparable markets. So you're right in thinking about Ghana and what was the case there, but I suspect that you will find this is going to be below what would have been offered at market rate. And one other quick sort of parameter also to think about is that were there, if it is close to market rate, then you should really be having market rate actors interested in this. So what oftentimes happens is that it is not taking into account the full risks of the venture. So if this were a typical market, typical investment opportunity where your risks are very aligned with most market rate investments, then maybe a rate of return that is close to the market rate of return is then actually meant to be market rate, right? But when you look at the underlying risks and how the risks are being perceived by investors, that will give you an idea of where this is in that investment may be able to play a catalytic role and is not really at the market rate. Is that helpful, Vandana? This is a slightly more convoluted response, but I feel like this reflects the reality that everything is not cut and dried, because in most places you also don't know what the market rate for a comparable investment would be that easily or directly.
Yeah, Harvey told me, like, if the market rate is based on, let's say, Ghanaian market, and I see Jean put it up as 28% locally in Ghana, and that is true, like, for many of the markets. It's just that if you have international players in these markets sometimes, and especially the DFIs and everybody coming in, I think I still feel like the 10 or 12% might still look like a not so conceptual.
Yeah, that it's not at the minimum level. Yeah, I think that there is a range within which this gets a little bit more sort of qualitative, or I would say it is subject to really how you look at the entire investment, right? Not just sort of the rate, but what it means. And I see the question in the chat also from Kate about market rate returns, but still accepts a disproportionate risk. Yeah, I think so, because the underlying issue here is that you are, if you take into account the risk, you're not really providing market rate returns, right? The returns are still at that level, but really the risk is disproportionate, which is oftentimes, even if you're close to the market rate in nominal numbers, you may not be getting really demand from investors, right? One of the sort of enduring challenges that we deal with in catalytic capital markets is the paucity of this kind of capital, right? And how you are able to access it. So that is all part of the story. And I think those are very interesting questions.
I had a follow-up question on what Kate had put in her question, that it is market rate returns, but still accepts disproportionate risk. But Jason, I thought it was like catalytic capital usually has to be concessional capital or not?
So for the definition, like it accepts, so it's and or, right? So it can be disproportionate risk or concessional return, or it can be both of them. So you can have market rate return, but if you are taking on disproportionate risk or going where conventional capital wouldn't go, then according to the definition, it would be catalytic capital.
I also
Thank
see
you.
a comment from, Vandana. I'm just going to quickly jump because Kudzai, did you have something to say related to this? Then we'll pause. If it's a different
Yeah.
question, we'll close this out.
Oh yeah, it was the last point that Jason mentioned, that in this case the catalytic capital seems to come from the disproportionate risk, because there was no cancer facility in the whole country. So capital going to start something completely new, which all investors have been shying away from, they are taking disproportionate risk in that instance.
Yeah, no, okay.
Vandana, did you want to add anything else, or feel free to put it in the chat? And I know that we'll give the microphone back to Jason in a moment.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. But this is I'm sorry, we don't have a lot of room for going deeper but into these questions, but these are the sorts of questions that we all struggle with, right? Because the last thing you want to do is bring in catalytic money when there is market rate money available, to be applied for that particular investment opportunity.
That's good. I think maybe to continue the conversation, the next session we're looking at barriers to catalytic capital. So I'm keen to hear from the group, what barriers do you believe there is in in increasing catalytic capital and even in deploying catalytic capital? From your own experience, because I think a lot of you, even just thinking about understanding what catalytic capital is, what are some of the potential hurdles you see in actually going and deploying it? What barriers do you think will prevent you from doing it? So,
can I go ahead? It's Kudzai here.
yes.
For me, I experienced two aspects. The first one was basically not having enough structuring capacity, or not being able to afford due structuring expertise or advice. Because the moment you bring catalytic into the play, there's a bit of thinking around the capital stack that needs to be considered. Then secondly, tied to that is legal structuring, particularly if you're dealing with an offshore catalytic capital supplier and you want to catalyze capital in a frontier market. It's tough. The legal frameworks are very different. I think by the time probably you get to the end of the structuring, you'll be running out of cash.
Yeah, those are good. I think those are really good and real barriers. And I like this because I think a lot of the stuff you guys are putting, I see even in the chats, getting buy-in from investors, structuring of capital, lack of data dissemination, success stories. Like, you're basically speaking to what my next few slides are going to be. So I think let's sit here for a little bit and see if there are any other barriers that people think have not actually been mentioned. Catherine, go ahead.
Hi there, I'm from Care International. We're piloting a program in West Africa at the moment in cocoa communities. So our experience is very much frontline with micro enterprises, and some of the barriers that we face include influencing and partnering with microfinance institutions on developing the right products and bringing in the right capital to de-risk and incentivize the expansion of MFI portfolios to reach those micro enterprises with catalytic capital effectively. And then on the other side, that kind of push-pull effect is that we're seeing a big gap in technical assistance and skills development and lack of funding there that goes really effectively alongside capital. I'll leave it there.
Nice. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Catherine. It's good. Seeing some great responses as well in the chat. Anyone want to unmute and share?
Hi, this is Tsero. I'll go. I think for me, one of the challenges we face is a currency mismatch, right? So if we're talking catalytic capital, but it's in dollar and we're deploying it in Pula, for instance, there is that, because the rate might be concessionary. But if you also factor in FX movements, right, then all of a sudden repaying in hard currency becomes a bit more of a challenge than it was perhaps when you secured that sort of capital from the onset. So I think sometimes that mismatch in Forex we're seeing can become a challenge in the long term.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, there's definitely that currency risk that is there.
Yes, Jason, Simbisai, yeah. I think also for me, it should be a limited investor base.
Sorry, Simbisai, I think you're breaking up, or it may just be me.
We don't have a lot of investors that are willing to put in catalytic capital. Limited investor base. We don't have a lot of investors who are willing to put in capital returns as an ecosystem.
Thanks, Simbisai. I struggled to hear you there. Yeah, and I see that our team said you also are breaking up. Do you want to maybe try share with your camera off again?
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, can hear you better.
Yes, I was saying that limited investor base. So you don't have a lot of investors who understand the role of catalytic capital. Yeah, and some of them are just unwilling, I think, because of being risk averse. So I think it's one of the barriers with barriers to catalytic capital deployment.
That's good. Great. No, thanks a lot, everyone. And I think what we're also going to see, Harvey's going to share a bit later, there are quite a few barriers. And so what I'm going to share with you now is not an exhaustive list, but some of you have already even touched on it. So the ones that we are going to put forward here is risk and return, regulatory, capacity, access, and mandate. So just in a little bit more detail, we've got risk and return barriers. So many investors, as we have seen, require market rate returns, and that because of that, they shy away from significant risks, whether they're real or perceived as one. Regulatory barriers, so institutional investors face certain regulatory constraints, which limits their ability in terms of liquidity, but also their risk and return flexibility. Capacity barriers, so this was mentioned as well. So catalytic capital transactions are often small, complex, and also bespoke, and they require significant work and time. And so also that technical assistance component was also mentioned previously. Access barriers, so looking at often these transactions are in more remote areas and geographies. So a lack of knowledge sourcing networks are quite challenging. And I think pipeline was also mentioned in the chat, if I saw that. Then mandate barriers. So having a champion or even institutional leadership that is willing to intentionally introduce this into their institution is really important, and trying to embed catalytic capital within some of their processes and their funding allocations is also one of the barriers that we are facing. But I know Harvey will chat a little bit more around some of these barriers and expand on it in this session. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we have hit 4 on the dot or around there. And so we can have a break. If you've got any questions, that continue to populate them in the chat. And then we can maybe take them in the Q&A session after Harvey shares with us after the break. So let's come back here at 10 past 4, I think, if that's correct. Najri, is that the time that we have?
Yeah, I think that should be fine. But if we could make it quick, just because I know there'll be lots of questions when Harvey comes on, so we just want to give him as much time as possible.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, we'll see you at about 8 past 4. So we'll be scored 2 more minutes. This is just the 2-minute warning. We're going to be starting in 2 minutes. So yeah, if we can get back to our seats. I don't know if some people are maybe walking around the room or stretching. I hope you are stretching, just so, especially I think, at least where I am, it's quite cold weather, so having a good stretch I think is important. But yeah, if we can head back to our seats, we're going to be starting shortly. Okay, before we start, I'm going to call on everyone to turn their cameras on, just so I can see that you are there, if that's okay. If you can't, then maybe just put an emoji, because I understand some of us are maybe not in a place where they can put their cameras on, or they're hopefully not driving while we're doing this meeting, because that probably won't be safe. But yeah, okay, seen some reactions. Good to see some faces as well. It's so cool. Some more reactions. Nice. Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, so like if we can, I think it does make quite a big difference if we are able to just be able to show our faces and yeah, just engage. And I think I also want to commend you as well. I think the previous session, I really appreciated your guys' inputs because, as you saw, even with the barriers, I mean, a lot of that knowledge is already there. So it's really good to share with each other. So with that in mind, I am super excited to hand over to Harvey. Yeah, so incredible to have you join us. I think we've punted you a few times already in the first hour. So really looking excited to your session. And yeah, and he's going to be sharing with us on some of the work they've been doing around capital gaps and putting together a framework, which he's been supporting C3 and putting together. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Harvey.
Great, thanks, Jason. And great to see you all in this session. I guess, yeah, just to preface the work before I dive in, and maybe whilst I'm trying to bring my slides up. This is really a sort of sneak preview, if you like, of work that we're currently developing at C3 at the moment. So this has been in gestation for the best part of the past year, work on capital gaps, and I'll explain why we got into this in a second. But just to say, it's a preview of work. It's a draft right now, but there'll be a final version that'll be coming out in September. So look out for that if this is of interest. And I will just say, you know, it will double click, if you like, on many of the things that we covered in the first hour, and maybe bring a little bit more granularity and nuance, right? So we're trying to take it to the next level in terms of how we describe the problems that we're solving for or trying to address, so that we can have a better shot of trying to solve those problems. And then I will just apologize. I hope you can see my slide on screen. There will be some very dense slides. You will probably not be able to read them. So just bear that in mind. We will circulate this PDF after the session that you can then read at your leisure. So think about it as I'll just walk you through what the material contains, highlight some of the key points. We'll have a discussion. And then you can, go through the materials in your own time. And then I'm very happy to, pick up on questions that you might have after the discussion through Jason, or come join you again. So just to dive in, see if I can do this right. So why did we get into the whole capital gaps discussion? And this really came up through the work that C3 supported in phase 1, which sort of ran until the early part of this year, because we funded a lot of work in a variety of grantees, a variety of markets, trying to understand where catalytic capital was having an impact, how it could be used, and so on, building the evidence base around catalytic capital. And we realized that basically all the grantees that we supported were trying to describe and understand capital gaps in some way, right? The function of catalytic capital is to try to address gaps, impact gaps, if you like, that are left by conventional capital. But we realized that it was all done in a variety of different ways. So we thought we probably do need to get better as a field at describing and understanding these gaps, because it helps us explain why we're doing it. So what is the motivation, right? So we talked about that with the uses earlier. So how do we get even crisper and more specific about why? Identifying and analyzing the barriers preventing capital from flowing. So not just the barriers around catalytic capital, which we just discussed, but the barriers around capital, any capital flowing into the gap, right? Because that's really what we are trying to address with our strategies. Trying to do this at a granular level. So, being as specific as possible about the situation we're going into, because the more specific we can be, the clearer will be about the barriers, and the clearer will be about our response. And then finally, all this leads to being able to better formulate strategies and investment parameters for how we respond. I think strategies is the key word here, right? So where this is most useful is when you're thinking about this not just on a sort of deal by deal basis, but thinking about it on a sort of strategic or programmatic or market level, right? And so what will be interesting, obviously catalytic capital is central to this conversation, but you will see when we get to the end of this that we will circle back to things like grants, NTA, and other kinds of, more philanthropic or related ecosystem levers, because they're all part of the mix, right? So what I hope to do with this work is also to show that all these pieces are connected, that catalytic capital is a key part of the toolkit, but the toolkit is obviously wider than just catalytic capital. So how does it all fit together? So that's where we are with this work. And then finally, last thing to say is, yes, people are doing parts or a lot of this work already, but what we found with the work that we supported was everyone was trying to describe gaps in a slightly different way. So this is an attempt to try to systematize to some extent, the work of trying to describe and respond to capital gaps. So I'll start with this. I hope to take the next maybe 20 minutes to step through this. We'll then, break for discussion and questions. And then, like I said, you'll get the deck afterwards to review at your leisure. But the first thing to start with is, actually, what causes gaps, right? So, what we've tried to do with this is set up a bit of a framework, if you like, for thinking about barriers to investment. So in terms of, if you think about the funds flowing from investors to investees, right, who have particular characteristics, sit in particular market contexts, have certain kinds of profiles, that's on the left-hand side. There are some barriers standing in the way between investors and investees. The ones that are most obvious to us, that we've been discussing quite a lot, even in this session, is what I think of as financial rational barriers. So there are deviations from market norms for risk, return, cost, time frame, and liquidity, right? So those are, if you like, rational, quite objective things, often quite, sometimes quantifiable, sometimes not quantifiable. But we can ground them in a sort of financial rational conversation. And then often, you'll see this in the footnote, market rules, so legal, regulatory, and standards frameworks often influence, some of these financial rational barriers, but they show up somehow, right, in terms of these barriers. Now, there are also other barriers, right, which we've classed as mindset barriers. So these could be attitudes. So these could be attitudes, opinions, feelings, biases, right, that we have about certain markets, market opportunities, market segments, certain deals, certain kinds of players, right, that may also get in the way of investment flowing. And then also awareness and familiarity, right? If you're not aware of or familiar with an opportunity, you may not see it, or you may dismiss it out of hand before you've even looked at the factors on the left-hand side, right? So actually, we think about barriers in their totality. We need to think about the full set of these barriers. And what we found as we worked through the examples is actually pretty much in every case we've looked at, there's a combination of both financial rational and mindset barriers. And it's important to note, all the ones that are relevant, because actually if you only address part of the barriers but not the others, then you don't really have a chance of, addressing the gap fully. So to give you an example, this is, an example which some of you might find familiar. So looking at investing in women-led SME funds or other investment vehicles in sub-Saharan Africa. So you'll see the characteristics of the vehicles on the left-hand side. And we've, outlined some of the key barriers to investment, right, that you might expect when those vehicles are trying to raise capital from asset allocators. Typically they would be DFIs in this context. And so you've got a range of financial rational barriers in terms of the deal size, below what DFIs typically prefer to invest. There's a range of risk-adjusted returns, some of which could be sub-market. Fund economics are challenging for small funds, right? So those are the things I think many of us will be aware of and which are much discussed, right? And then on the mindset side, you have a bunch of other ones. Obviously, you might expect, gender bias, social cultural norms could be one with some investors. But also, there's a bias towards more familiar financing channels, right? So there's a bias towards regulated FIs as the pathway to financing small businesses. That's what's familiar to DFIs, right? So funds and other kinds of investment vehicles might be sort of outside the comfort zone. And then even within that, there's a bias towards known constructs, familiar constructs, established investment domiciles, and so on, right? So those are all mindset barriers that are also present. And so in order to really structurally try to close this gap, you would need to think about addressing both the financial rational and mindset barriers. The other thing that, I think is worth pointing out as we sort of do this scene setting is not all gaps are alike, right? So part of what this work is also trying to do is to say, actually, you often need to disaggregate gaps. So in any large area of financing shortfall, SME finance, right? Say in Sub-Saharan Africa, that's huge. So it is possible, obviously, to have a conversation about barriers for that space and what you could do about it, but you end up at a very high level of abstraction, right? Whereas actually, if you break it down into more specific situations, you can become much clearer about, for instance, what is the degree of flexibility that's required. So this was analysis that we borrowed from recent work that ISF advisors did with USAID, sort of very much related to the FASA program, which some of you may know. And so one of the question is, actually, if you look at financing agri-SMEs in Sub-Saharan Africa, what is the degree of flexibility that's required when you're underwriting new funds for agri-SME finance? Which then takes you to the question, well, what are the barriers that each of those situations faces and the severity of those barriers? And so I won't go through all the detail, but one of the things we found is actually as you travel from overall SMEs down to the largest agri-SMEs, what we call the top 5% of the market, or what ISF calls top 5% of the market, down to the great unserved, the 95% of the market, that's unserved, and then all the way through to very small early stage agri-ventures looking for equity investment. You basically have this kind of continual buildup of more and more barriers, right? It just gets more and more severe as you go deeper into the gap, mostly on the financial rational side, but also on the mindset side. And we know that there are a range of financing pathways, of financing channels, different kinds of funds that are serving these different situations, all the way from wholesale debt funds through large FIs, down through direct debt funds, all the way to early venture equity funds. Now, you'll see that the financing, the indicators and financing parameters for each of the funds changes, right, as you travel down into the gap. And things like the degree of fund senior protection, which ISF analyzed in their sample of funds, increases very substantially as you travel further into the gap. And so the reason it was interesting for us was this starts to illustrate the clarity and value that you can have by identifying certain situations, understanding the barriers to that, and then tying it to the financing parameters that we're seeing in the market, which then, if you think about something like FASA or some other investors that's trying to underwrite, new funds with catalytic capital, it gives you a sense for calibrating, what is the kind of support that's required, right? What are the benchmarks for which kinds of funds? Because if you don't disaggregate it and you have investors who are, working at the top 5%, versus those who are looking at early stage agri ventures, speaking at cross purposes because actually they think they're talking about the same thing when in fact they're talking about different situations within the same space, right? So disaggregating them, we think is a good thing to do. And then the next step that we also suggest is actually, we had that earlier discussion in the session about the different roles of catalytic capital, seeding, scaling, and sustaining, right? So are these transient gaps or are they, sort of deep structural permanent gaps? And so what we realized as we looked at this is actually, it's also not completely binary like that, right? So often we'll have a sort of degree of confidence, a degree of potential in terms of being able to remove those barriers over time. So we think it's also good in doing this analysis to try to specify some of the reasons as a hypothesis, right, for how you could remove barriers, and then sort of give an assessment here with the Harvey balls of showing how confident we are that those things could be removed, and we'll pick up later in terms of how we might want to use those. This is a different example. Again, MSC, as an MSME rooftop solar in India was another example that we used in working up the framework. Again, I won't go into this too much of the detail, but we did the same thing in terms of identifying the barriers, thinking about the potential to remove those barriers. But the so what comes with then saying, okay, if we have these barriers to investment, right, between this financing channel and the investee situation, what do we do about it, right? And so the framework, if you like, then moves to actually, if we're clear on the barriers to investment, then trying to close the capital gap should then involve responding to those barriers, right? So here you'll see, you know, we've sort of tagged them A to F, different things that you could be doing to try to address those things, whether that's higher risk or lower cost or higher uncertainty, lack of awareness, and so on. I think, and on the next slide, we have some detail on, you know, each of those boxes. And of course, in this case, it's based on a real example from what Encourage Capital have been leading in India, funded by KfW and others. So what you'll see with this is, you know, they're color-coded because the red is actually the, if you like, the catalytic capital piece, the investment pieces, which in this case was a sort of, you know, growth equity investment in selected non-bank financial companies from Encourage Capital, as well as a partial risk first loss facility. Those were the financial, you know, sort of innovations, if you like, the investment innovations supported by Catalytic Capital. But then the other four boxes are really sort of grant and TA, right? So again, sort of tying this back, we see the role of Catalytic Capital in these strategies. But in this case, it wouldn't have been possible to do without the related grant capital, you know, largely for what you might call, you know, ecosystem building, right? So in this case, the performance of installations for rooftop solar hugely depend on the quality of installation and the quality of the installers, right? So actually, without standards and systems and vetting of installers, you can't get high performance. You've got, you know, unacceptable risk, and therefore the whole thing's going to fall over. So to get this whole thing to work, you need to build that ecosystem. You need to help, you know, the lenders to develop new products that work for the customer and so on. So it's all part of a package. But I think the point we're trying to underscore here is actually, you know, instead of just, you know, defaulting to saying, well, you know, we need Catalytic Capital and therefore and then some grant and some TA, the question is, you know, what actually is required and how do those actually solve the barriers, right? So this is what the analysis sort of helps to set up, and hopefully can lead us to sort of more complete and well-considered strategies. The final example I'll just touch on, and this, you know, we're using in the materials as a sort of end-to-end example of how you would apply this tool to try to formulate some complete strategies, or at least formulate a range of potential responses and interventions from which you could build, you know, your strategy. Now, I recognize this is a very different context, you know, from the ones that we are discussing in this room, so apologies for that. But we did want to actually consider a range of different examples from very different markets and very different kinds of sectors and very different kinds of themes, just to make sure that the toolkit that we're developing was flexible enough to deal with all of that. So in this case, this is about converting businesses, you know, small, medium-sized businesses to employee ownership, in particular in the US in this case, because there's a particular moment with transitions as baby boomers retire and want to dispose of their businesses. I won't go into the details of the EO models because that's a whole discussion in itself. But I will note that for this exercise, we said actually it's also quite helpful to identify who we are, right? So you need to be clear on your perspective in order to do the right analysis. So in this case, we said, you know, we're probably a philanthropy or family office that has both investment and sort of grant making arms. We're able to make investments, do grant funding, we could do influencing, we could do advocacy. And really importantly, we're looking for a pathway with a graduation thesis, right? So to go back to what Jason introduced earlier on the roles, we're thinking about seeding and scaling roles, right? And not the sustaining role. It's not to say that's not a value judgment on sustaining roles, but let's say, if we are looking to do a seeding and scaling role, then we need to be looking at situations where we believe there's a reasonably high potential for this gap to be closed over time, right? And to be clear on what it would take for the gap to be closed over time. Otherwise, it's not going to graduate. So without going too much detail, you'll see the information in the deck, and also there are links to some other materials on employee ownership models in the US, if that's of interest. There is also a great report out on employee ownership, investing in employee ownership in Africa from PDI, which came out recently, that I can highly recommend if you're interested. And so again, as with the earlier ones, we've identified a number of selected situations, right, in what is a very diverse landscape out there, all the way from what we've called mainstream private equity, sort of ownership, right, where employees get a payment, when the PE investor exits, all the way through to very deep impact, 100% ownership, co-op models, democratic governance of often smaller companies, right? So you've got a whole range of different situations. There are actually, of course, there are more than 3 situations, but we're presenting 3 here to make this usable, and they also vary in terms of scale, right? So as you can expect, as you go further down the gap, there are many more smaller businesses that could be addressed. And this is a theme that recurs with many of the examples, as you travel further into sort of smaller and smaller businesses, smaller and smaller deals, you get further into the gaps, and there are more and more barriers. As before, what we see is, as you travel into the gap, so you go further down into the gap and there's increasing capital constraints, there are more barriers that crop up, both on the financial side and on the mindset side. So this is looking at direct investment from funds and lenders into the conversions. And we think there is, reasonably good potential to dismantle the barriers. At the very top, we think that's pretty much already mainstream, right? There are basically just mindset barriers because it's not well understood in the market, but it's starting to get there. And there are no real sort of net financial barriers to doing it. At the bottom, you've got, very, very entrenched barriers, which probably means that it's, we don't think it's likely to graduate over time. And so this middle situation, from the perspective of, say, a philanthropy that's looking for a graduation pathway, we might say, this segment or situation in the middle is one that we want to look at, right? And then we've outlined on the right the kinds of things that we think might be needed to try to do that. So it's a way of prioritizing from this landscape. And then as part of that, we can also look at which financing channels, which funds are addressing this segment. And in this case, you've got these closed-end EO funds, Apis and Heritage, which was a Skoll awardee this year. Great for them, they're doing fantastic work. But these are the new funds that are now providing dedicated, essentially, mezzanine debt financing for these EO conversions. And they're offering, or at least even the investors investing in those funds, I should say, are expecting sort of IRRs in the mid-teens. So this is sort of at or near market expectation in terms of return. However, it is new, right? So to the point that we made earlier, it is innovative, it's novel. And so for a lot of players in the market, it comes with certainly a perception of disproportionate risk, right? And so it is more catalytic capital that's going into these funds at the moment. But in time, it could potentially graduate to more conventional capital. And so if we think this is something to focus on, right, in the sort of persona that we have as a philanthropy that's trying to support this pathway and get it to graduation, what will we need to do, right? So probably what we need to do is think about it end to end, right? So you've got the investee situations, the conversions, you've got the funds, which are the financing channel, and you've got asset allocators, which is not just the catalytic allocators, but actually all asset allocators, because in time we want to graduate this to conventional capital. And, together with that, we then want to be clear about what are the barriers to investment. So we'd already discussed the direct barriers to investment earlier, or seen that on the earlier slide. We also want to then capture on the right-hand side the indirect barriers to investment, right? So these funds, as they're going to raise money from asset allocators, are also facing certain barriers. Some of those are financial, which relate to the challenges they're facing on the direct side. But some of those are mindset, right? So, and we've heard a range of different things here, right? All the way, from sort of, some investors think this sounds a bit socialist, right? So I'm uncomfortable with some of the associations with this. Some, asset allocators don't know which impact categories to put this into, because employee ownership is an established impact category. So they might need help to relate it to social justice or something else, that's established in their portfolio, and also asset classes, where does this fit, right? Because it's not equity, it's not, senior debt, where do we put this? So helping people to navigate all those barriers would be part of the work of trying to address this gap. And so finally, and then I'll sort of stop, and then we can go to discussion. Again, as with the previous example, what being clear about the barriers allows you to do is think about what are the responses, right? So in this case, you'll see more colors. So the red is still, the investment response. So, what does it take to capitalize these funds? And we've talked about, you'll see in the detail here, there's, ticket sizes, accepting disproportionate risk, potentially doing guarantees, assessing first-time managers in the right way, right? Because a lot of these are new managers, new funds, maybe warehousing facilities. So, some of these things are also familiar from the African context with new funds, but also we're looking at some other levers, right? So there's obviously grant and TA, but also we've said actually sometimes what you need to do is influence other market actors, right? Actually, sometimes it's investors engaging with other investors, other asset allocators, to help them understand this opportunity, right? Because without doing that, we won't be able to move the market and close the gap. And then the final thing that we've got in green here is sometimes there's also a need to change market rules. So on this front, in this context, there's a lot of ongoing work. There's a bill in Congress at the moment in the US looking to change sort of degree of state support essentially for this area. It has bipartisan support, and that could really revolutionize the potential for this to scale up. And so if all of those things are successful, we then have a much stronger potential to get this onto a strong graduation pathway and get it to graduate in time, right? It's not going to be an overnight thing, but in the years to come to move it towards graduation. And then the final thing I'll just note is, on these slides, we think it's also good practice to, in the right-hand column, talk about, what we think is likely in terms of whether this is going to be time limited, right? So you'd hope that, it's another check really on thinking about the roles of catalytic capital. If it's seeding or scaling, you're looking for an indication that it's probably going to be time limited. Even if you can't totally predict how long it's going to take, it shouldn't be something that we need to do in the long term. Now, if it's the sustaining role of catalytic capital, which we talked about earlier, that is meant to be an ongoing permanent role, right? We're not thinking that it will ever resolve itself, and therefore we need to provide that support long term. Great. So I will pause. I'll just say that we will be publishing this together with a sort of methodology, right? So steps that you would go through to try to apply this set of tools to the problems that you're looking at in order to arrive at strategy and investment parameters for your response. So that's coming out in September. And in the meantime, we will circulate this deck after the session. If you have any questions or feedback actually on the work, as we're finalizing the materials, actually any sort of immediate feedback, from you all is also very helpful in making sure that we put something out there that's clear and usable. So let me just stop there and hand back to Jason.
Great, thanks so much, Harvey. I think that's great. Let's open up the floor for discussion and questions. I think there was one in the chat. Seho, do you want to maybe expand a little bit and ask your questions, Harvey?
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the warehousing concept. I haven't come across it before, and how that works and how that can be used. I'm not sure, to either help with pipeline, or how does that fit in, really?
Yeah, no, good question. And this is something I should say that's come up in multiple contexts, right? And particularly in the context of, or particularly in the situation where we find first-time managers, because first-time managers find it difficult to demonstrate, track record, and even to demonstrate that they've got a pipeline of investments, right? So how, this chicken and egg situation, we can't do it until we have a fund set up, but it takes years to raise for the fund, set up the fund, right? So how do we demonstrate we can do something in the meantime? So investors, some investors have set up warehousing facilities where managers can essentially make their first investments into the warehouse, right? And roll that into the fund when they finally have that set up. But through that initial warehousing facility, demonstrate that they've got, the pipeline, that they've got good investments lined up. And so it's something that we've seen more in the African context. And, we've sort of borrowed it into the US analysis that you saw me share last, because we think that's also an approach that could be useful for the US context.
Great, thanks, Seho. Anyone else? Any questions, reflections? Even comments are welcomed. Okay, we'll go Carlo and then Gladys. I don't know who was first.
Thank you so much, Jason. I just a comment, not necessarily a question, but I think this is quite an interesting model or framework that you have. So the work I do is I work at a philanthropy, and so we try to build different programs or institutions that will fill these ecosystem gaps, but taking an impact perspective. So it's quite nice, because the piece that we've been trying to close the gap on, which is why I'm here, is around then what kind of, I suppose, vehicle to house these programs in when we want to spin them off, so that they can attract the right funding and get kind of the right ecosystem players to support them. So this is actually quite a nice framework, just to say as feedback and a comment. If there are any other players in different contexts doing the same thing, I think this gives a nice lens to apply to say, if you're building for impact and you're interested in doing that early investment in the idea or the programming, but this kind of closes the gap quite nicely for me around what vehicle to house that solution in, so that I can spin it off quite effectively. So thank you. I think it's awesome. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for the feedback. Yeah. And I do think, yes, I think this has a particular relevance for philanthropic actors that are active in catalytic capital, right? Because it says, catalytic capital has a pivotal role, but you need to kind of look at this more holistically and systemically, right? And philanthropy often has, is the actor that has those other tools. in order to be able to do that. So I'm great that landed.
Thanks so much, Gladys.
All right, this is just feedback for Harvey. Thank you so much for that framework, and I'm looking forward to getting the full report as well, the slides. It was dense, but I did pick out, I just wanted to mention that breaking down the barriers into direct, indirect, and financial rational and mindset was really, really useful. I think the bigger challenge is around the mindset. Because that's even harder to track. You need the traction, you need the track record, and you need the willingness of the actors to change their mindset. So the financial bit, that was pretty straightforward, but because we've been raising a fund, I find that the mindset is the hardest thing. And if you can crack that, if we can crack that as an ecosystem, it would change a lot for the financial landscape. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they are hard, right? So I think, you know, I think we're very cognizant of the degree of challenge here, you know, because sometimes when you put things up on a slide, you can create the expectation that, oh, we've named it now, so now we can go solve it, right? But actually, you know, they're incredibly hard to shift, and I would agree with you. Often they are the hardest things to shift. I think it does sort of, you know, throw down the gauntlet, right, to catalytic capital investors in particular, right? And maybe expand this notion of what is it that we expect catalytic capital investors to do? You know, is it only to deploy capital, or is it to influence others in the market? And if it is to influence others in the market, how, right? And do they need to be thinking about their strategies, their team capacity, you know, their outreach capability, you know, what are the roles that, you know, that they are performing in this market, you know? And I think we see it, you know, I guess just to go back to C3, you know, that is what C3 is doing, right? It is not only investing, the members are not only investing, they're using their voice, you know, and the forums created by C3 to directly, in many of these cases, I mean, not just this session, but actually in other groups that are facilitated directly by the C3 team, you know, have peer-to-peer conversations between investors, between asset allocators, because actually we've realized that that is the way that we can get people to start to shift their mindsets. If we can get sort of frank and open conversation between investors on why, you know, why not, you know, they should be going into these different areas. So I do think it will sort of, yeah, raise that challenge and hopefully get some responses to that.
Vandana?
Yes. Thanks, Harvey, and thanks, Jason. I was just wondering, you know, a lot of catalytic capital, even guarantee funds, everything goes to financial institutions or aggregators in some of these models, right? What I have noticed is with financial institutions, I'm based in Kenya, for example, and then these financial institutions do not change their processes or adapt to a new fund or a mechanism, because they're like, if we change for one fund, we'll have to change it across the institution, across our working, because if one SME comes to us for a particular fund, but we are willing to take an additional risk, but what about they come back to us later and this particular tranche of fund is finished or whatever, like we're not going to change our processes for every single fund. But usually the other DFIs and so on give these funding to the FIs specifically for this reason, right? That they actually take a bit more risk on something like this. How do you, so it's neither mindset nor, I mean, it's just this lack of changing existing processes also from a different this thing. How do you see that, like as a barrier? Where does it fall for you?
I think it's in both, actually. So we, you know, so if you think about that barrier, which is, you know, I guess broadly, it's sort of organizational and institutional lack of capacity and readiness, they're not set up to do it, right? You can break that down into the different components. Part of it is financial rational, because essentially there are increased costs from doing it, right? There's an inefficiency because they're trying to do things, they're trying to do things. Well, actually, so if I start with the left-hand side, there could be increased costs because, things are much harder to do, takes more time to do it. Our processes are not optimized for it, so we're not going to do it because it's too costly, and it, both in terms of time and effort and hassle and actual money, right? It might also result in finance not flowing, right? Because risk is elevates, right? So for instance, we can't do cash flow based lending, right, to SMEs. We need collateral. It's inadequate collateral. Finance doesn't flow, right? So there's a risk mismatch on that side. But then there's also, I would say, mindset, right? So people are not, everything from it's more prestigious to serve corporate clients. I don't want to be dealing with these small businesses, right? Or small businesses are, kind of not dynamic, I don't want to be serving them, right? Or just organizational culture, right? So all those I would say are more mindset. And I think what's interesting is having, to come back to like why we would have this more complete view, if we have, say, interventions that are only focused on, redesigning processes, but not changing culture, right? The thing is still not going to work, right? Because you're going to have processes that are set up for doing the new kind of business, but people are still going to be in their heads, functioning on the old software, right? So does that make sense in terms of, evolving, maybe taking all the pieces that we've done in the past, but thinking about a more complete set of responses?
I agree, Harvey. I was just wondering if, we do not have the influence sometimes. Let's say if I'm representing a DFI and I'm providing funding in a particular way to a particular financial institution in Kenya, we cannot change the mindset, we cannot change their processes, we cannot change their structures. As much as we're providing the finance to enable some of these changes, it's still very difficult then from an external perspective to influence some of these decisions, right? So how does that, it's just thinking out loud. I'm not looking for answers for sure, but it's just like, it's so difficult to not just change the mindset of it, but also the existing structures, processes, culture, everything, right? And it's not just coming from a place where you're giving the money and being done with it, right? And I think that's what brings a lot of complexities in the kind of work that we do, I guess.
Yeah. No, so I can speak I have a personal opinion on this. This is not official, right? But I am a pessimist, when it comes to retrofitting established FIs to serve, to serve underserved segments, right? It's very hard to get the zebra to change its stripes. It's going to be often new kinds of players, right? History in all sorts of different markets show that often it is new entrants with different business models, new business models, right? So if we look at the experience of India, all the way from MFIs through to the new NBFCs that are serving SME markets, they've developed new business models and processes and systems and approaches that the banks are just, don't do, have never done, possibly will never do, And actually the roles that the banks have stepped into, in the Indian market is providing wholesale funding to the new players to serve those, to serve those new segments at the retail level, because the banks are not organized to do it. And actually that is the ecosystem that has emerged. I think we're starting to see this with fintechs in many markets, and peer-to-peer lenders. Yeah, that's my own person, which is not to say, I know that, Argidius, others have made some inroads with, trying to change behavior with the banks, but I would just say, yeah, on an overall level, I'm not hugely optimistic. And that's why, for instance, with the EO, the employee ownership case that we described, actually banks have been lending to this sector. The problems that banks aren't doing enough, right? And there is no pathway that gets us to banks doing enough to serve these new segments. That's why these new funds are being set up to serve this new opportunity, completely new ways, right? Completely new products. The banks are never going to do that in that context. And so, again, I think this goes back to the earlier comment. Just because something is mindset doesn't mean we can change it, right? Often they are the hardest, most resistant things to change.
So one last point on this, like in terms of mindset, why I keep thinking of the banks is because end of day, the DFIs, like be it World Bank, be it FMO, like be it these large institutions, still prefer to work with banks, right? Because in their mind, these are the least risky of the lot. So it's just how it is structured. So you find this, I mean, we know at the ground level what is working and what is not, but where does the biggest cash flow happen? It's still through that channel, right? Like, so it's just quite interesting how it is perceived in that sense. Anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mandana. Thanks, Harvey. I think we're going to wrap it there for now. Just a quick one, Harvey. There was a request if you could share the research on employee ownership in Africa. Was it Southern Africa?
Yes, I'll drop that in the chat.
Yeah, in Africa. That would be great. Thank you. And yeah, if we can give Harvey a round of applause, please, with the little reactions. Just thanks so much for your time, for your insights, and even just sharing those resources. I think at least from our side, it's really incredible just to see the granular, the kind of like the detail you can go into, like you say, a more granular view of some of the stuff that we introduced in the first hour, which I think is incredible. So thanks so much. And I'm going to wrap up. So just to kind of conclude what we went through today, we really looked at catalytic capital on the spectrum, seeing that it's a subset of impact investing. Then we took that, we looked at what it is in terms of the role of philanthropy and the role that grant capital plays within the space as well, noting that when we speak about catalytic capital, we are really looking at investment capital, where there's an expectation of return. We also saw that blended finance, it is a core ingredient of blended finance, but catalytic capital can be deployed outside of blended finance. And then we looked at the roles and uses, so seeding, scaling, and sustaining, and then some of the uses around facilitating and all that. And we also looked at barriers, which we then went into a little bit more detail in Harvey's presentation. So I think we've covered quite a lot of ground today, and I think there's always room for kind of diving a bit deeper. So we will share some materials after the call as well, if you want to go and look a little bit deeper into that. I also want to make myself available for the last 5 minutes. I think it is important that if anyone's struggling to access the platform, if you can just maybe stay on, and then we can see if we can address that. But with that, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you next week. And yes, I see they put up the WhatsApp code. So please join the WhatsApp group for this year. It'll just be a great way to keep the community going and share resources and communication, streamline communication as well.